From MKUltra to the pit of despair, research into the human psyche has a long, dark history, and today we are diving right into it. From human isolation experiments to animal testing, and all the legally murky waters in between. Here are the top 10 psychological experiments in history that are pure evil. Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have Donald Hebb's experiments. In the 1950s, Donald Hebb, who was a professor of psychology at McGill University in Montreal, began a study to see how sensory isolation affects humans. He gave male graduate students $20 a day to stay in small rooms with basically only a bed in them. They had little human contact, only when being given food and when being led to the bathrooms. They also took it a step further and had U-shaped pillows to cover their ears to block out noise, as well as gloves to limit their sense of touch. Every person in the experiment said that they found their thinking and thought processes were affected as they couldn't focus on any one thing. Before long, the participants began having intense auditory and visual hallucinations. The plan was to observe them for 6 weeks to see how they were impacted, but none of them lasted more than just a few days. Every participant was far too distraught after only a few days for the experiment to continue for any longer. It is crazy how quickly this all began to happen, but I'm glad that they got them all out of there and stopped the research right there. In our number 9 spot today, we have the Milgram Experiment. The premise of this experiment was that they took two groups of people, one called teachers and one called learners, and paired them up, one from each group. The pair couldn't see each other, but the teacher would ask the learner a question. If the learner got it wrong, the teacher was then told to give them an electric shock. Every question made the shocks get worse until an eventual fatal shock would be administered. Before the experiment, it was proposed that only 3% of the participants would go all of the way and actually give the fatal shock, but it turned out that under pressure, 65% of the teachers actually gave the lethal dose of electricity to their learner counterparts. Luckily, the students actually were just actors, so no one was truly getting hurt or shocked to death in this experiment, but it honestly still is very creepy and very disturbing to see these poor people being pushed so far past their boundaries, and it's kind of unsettling to know about the results. In our number 8 spot today, we have the re-education experiments. This is less of an experiment and more a type of punishment that was seen in a prison in Romania that was built in the late 1930s. The prison was called the Pitești prison, and the punishment is called the re-education experiments. Basically, this was a 3-step process intended to brainwash prisoners into giving up their religious and political beliefs and to alter their personality to a point where they would just be completely obedient. The first step was known as external unmasking, and it involved torment being used along with interrogation. This led to the prisoners revealing everything about themselves and even confessing to crimes that they didn't commit. The second stage was called internal unmasking, which involved making the prisoners give the names of people who were kind or lenient to them in the early interrogations. The third phase is called public moral unmasking, and it involves being humiliated in public as well as having to renounce their entire belief system. As an example, a Christian would be dressed up as Christ and made to disgrace religious texts and sacred symbols. Prisoners would have their heads dunked into buckets of urine or worse. It all gets worse from here, but I'll save you the disgusting details. The prison ended up being closed in 1952, and some of the people who took part and led these horrible things ended up being executed for their crimes. In our number 7 spot today, we have the facial expressions experiment. In 1924, a psychologist with the University of Minnesota, Carney Landis, wanted to conduct an experiment to study facial expressions. More specifically, he wanted to see if everyone's expressions of emotions were the same. Does happiness look the same on everyone? Does sadness, shock, disgust, etc. make us all react the same way facially? An interesting question for sure, but the method was strange. Basically, he recruited some student volunteers and then painted the lines of their facial muscles black. He then exposed each participant to different stimuli in order to photograph their reactions, and then of course compare the results. This is all fine except for what the stimuli actually contained. I guess this guy wanted big reactions because he included showing them adult films, exposing them to ammonia, making them touch reptiles, and even beheading rats. Apparently, 1/3 of the participants willingly did the beheading when told, despite not knowing how to do it humanely and Even if they did, why would you? And for the 2/3 that were regular and did not just behead a rat because a strange man told them to, unfortunately, Carney did it for them. I'm not even sure what the results of this experiment were, and I have to ask, does it even matter? What an actual nightmare for something that largely doesn't really matter at all. In our number 6 spot today, we have Ian Robbins' experiment. In 2008, Ian Robbins set out to do an experiment that would test what happened to people when their senses were extremely limited and they were totally isolated. He put 6 volunteers in soundproofed rooms and waited to see what would happen. Before long, their sense of time became extremely distorted and they began getting paranoid. One of the subjects, named Adam Bloom, said that without light, it had felt like his brain was going to sleep. Adam hallucinated a pile of 500 oyster shells, which he could describe in incredible detail, and by the end, he said he was honestly losing the will to live. When Adam went to take tests after the 48 hours was over, they found that his ability to process information had been impaired. Luckily, this was just an experiment and all of the participants were able to return to their normal lives just a few days later. In our number 5 spot today, we have the Hofling Hospital experiment. This experiment happened all the way back in 1966 in a time where the rules of psychological experiments were a lot more loosey-goosey. Because of this, the nurses that were all a part of this experiment had no idea that they were participants, which nowadays would be illegal. Basically, this experiment took place on the night shift. The night nurse would receive a phone call during the shift, and on the other end would be Dr. Smith, who's actually the researcher. He would ask the nurses to check the medicine cabinet to see if they had a drug called astrotin, which was actually a drug that was made up for this experiment, and it was just a placebo. The astrotin would clearly state the maximum dosage of 10 milligrams, but Dr. Smith would ask the nurses to administer 20 milligrams. They were told that the doctor was in a hurry and he would sign the authorization papers as soon as he came to see the patient later on that night. If the nurse decided to give the patient the drug, they would be breaking 3 rules. They are not allowed to accept instructions over the phone, the dose was double the maximum limit stated on the box, and the medicine itself was unauthorized. It was not on the ward stock list, so it shouldn't be in use at the hospital. Out of the 22 unknowing nurse participants, 21 of them went to administer this drug. That's insane. This wasn't to say that nurses are bad people or bad at their job, but this experiment combined with the interviews that happened afterwards just showed how the power imbalance and the social pressures that come along with everything can affect the outcome of a workplace extremely drastically, and in this case, it really could have been a matter of life and death. In our number 4 spot today, we have Operation Midnight Climax. This experiment took place in the 1950s, and it was one of those mind control research projects that was sponsored by the CIA. This was actually just one experiment that was a part of MKUltra. So basically, they wanted to study the effects of LSD, but instead of finding willing participants, which, let's be honest, probably wouldn't have been that difficult, they used non-consenting people who were lured to safe houses by workers who were being paid by the CIA, and then once at these safe houses, they were slipped the drug and monitored from behind a one-way glass. For over a decade, the project gave the government more knowledge about the drug itself and what it does to the mind. It gave the knowledge about surveillance technology and even sexual blackmail. In the end, the project was shut down in 1965 because drugging people is not a good look for the government. In our number 3 spot today, we have the Pit of Despair. This experiment was conducted by Henry Harlow and is one of the most controversial on this list. In a sort of mental health study, Henry decided to induce depression in monkeys. He took very young monkeys and separated them from their peers and mothers and put them into isolation in a cage that was called the Pit of Despair. Sometimes the monkeys would stay there for longer, more extended periods. Other times they would be repeatedly separated and put into the cage for multiple shorter stays. These monkeys all proved to be extremely psychologically disturbed after the conclusion of this experiment, which should have seemed kind of obvious even before the experiment was conducted. These monkeys were used as a model of human clinical depression, but here's where things get sadder than they already were. These monkeys were unable to be treated and rehabilitated. Despite various forms of treatment, they were just unable to get to a place they would have been had they not have been subject to a cruel experiment. In our number 2 spot today, we have psychic driving. Another part of Project MKUltra, this experiment was conducted by British psychiatrist Donald Ewan Cameron, who created the psychic driving concept that the CIA found interesting. Basically, psychic driving was a procedure that subjects patients to a continuous repeated audio loop of something that is intended to change their behavior. The patients would be exposed to hundreds of thousands of repetitions of a singular statement through the course of their treatment, and they would also be subjected to paralytic drugs that would subdue them while being exposed to the looped message. Yeah, so the CIA heard about this idea for a treatment and thought, that sounds cool, and then they started sending money to fund Cameron's experiments, but he didn't actually know it was coming from the CIA because they used a front. So Cameron's psychic driving experiments for MKUltra began to take place in Canada. I guess they said that the aim of the experiments were to get rid of, or quote, cure someone of schizophrenia by erasing existing memories and reprogramming the psyche. I'm not sure that's how schizophrenia works, but I guess they did. Cameron would subject patients to LSD, paralytic drugs, and electroconvulsive therapy that was 30 to 40 times the normal power. He would also put the experiment subjects into drug-induced comas while exposing them to the repetitive audio. The experiments were mostly conducted on patients who entered the institute for more common problems like anxiety disorders or postpartum depression, and they ended up leaving with permanent effects from his actions. These included things like urinary incontinence, amnesia, being unable to speak. Some people forgot their parents and thought that the interrogators were their parents. It clearly completely altered those who were participating in these horrible and certainly unethical experiments. In our number 1 spot today, we have the UCLA Schizophrenia experiments. Starting in 1983, UCLA researchers Michael Gitlin and Keith Norcherlin went to great and pretty unethical lengths to see just how people who were suffering from schizophrenia relapse. Basically, they were trying to figure out if there was a way to predict the relapse or psychosis episode, and this is definitely important work that deserves attention because it certainly could have real-world benefits, but that does not mean that unethical lengths should be reached. Unfortunately, this experiment involved recruiting hundreds of participants who were all being treated for schizophrenia and then taking them off of their medication. This alone has some very obvious implications for the health of these people, but to make matters worse, there was no suitable plan in place for when they could return to their medication, and they also didn't do a good enough job at making sure those participating were protected and safe given their very vulnerable state. Unfortunately, the results were disastrous and proved to be fatal when one of the participants, Antonio Lamadrid, ended up taking his own life. In an article from 1994, it also says that the doctors failed to get proper informed consent from the patients as well. I'm not sure exactly what that means and whether or not the patients had any idea of what would be happening during these tests. Alright guys, that has been our list for today. Thanks so much for checking it out. I've been your host today, Olivia Kozlowski, and I will see you next time. Goodbye. Sterlin? No Sterlin? That's a long ass last name for a shitty guy. An interesting question for sure.